Great, I think we're live. Hi. That's a good way to start. We can do some kind of hello. Hello, everyone. My name is Lori Beth Goldman, and this is episode number 53 of Exploring Genuine Transformation. For those of you who don't know me, I am a licensed psychotherapist and a psychospiritual mentor. And I have a passion for working with women who have been in the personal growth space and in the spiritual self-development world for a long time and still feel stuck, and have somehow, as many of us have, internalized being a perpetual self-development project. So I'm interested in supporting women to move through that so that they can enjoy their lives. So that's a little bit about me for those of you who don't know me. And this show is an exploration into what genuine transformation is. And part of my interest in this show is interviewing different coaches, thought leaders, and therapists about transformation as a way of waking up, having more of ourselves, having more intimacy with life, as opposed to transformation as a way to get our needs met or get what we think we want in life, but more of an inner journey, we could say, that also includes the outer. So I'm really excited today to be interviewing Michael Author. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. That's what I'm supposed to say, right?
You're doing great.
You're honored to have me here. I have deigned to appear upon your show. Anyway, no, seriously. What are we talking about?
My intro was so serious that we have to break it up so that we can have some levity here.
Pattern interrupt.
That's right. So this is one of the reasons that I'm excited to have Michael on the show, is because I just really appreciate and enjoy his energy. And we could even say that in and of itself, right, is transformational. Like just being able to be and be alive and just show up as we are. So we're already starting that way. The topic for today is relationships as a catalyst for personal transformation. And we are going to be talking about probably mostly romantic relationships or intimate relationships. And Michael has a lot of his work and his life's work, we could say, also, it focuses on men's work, but it also focuses on alternative forms of outside of monogamy. So we could say polyamory or other ways of relating. I'm sure we could probably extend it beyond polyamory, right?
I use the term non-monogamy most of the time because it's defining by a negative, but it's a catch-all. Anything that is not the traditional script of, I date someone, we see if it works and we get married, then we have kids and we get a house and we stay together forever. And or even I only just date one person at a time, and then my personal issues come up and we break up, and then I get depressed, and then I go out and I find somebody else to date, and then I date them, and then my personal issues come up, I don't want to look at them, they blow up, I get depressed, and then I find somebody else, right? Serial monogamy.
Yeah, that was a really good description of serial monogamy.
That's what most people do.
Yeah, that's true. And it was also a description of actually what this topic is going to be, because one of the things that we're looking at is that there's a model out there of probably 95% of relationships are, I would say, I'm not sure about the exact percentage, but that's really based on we are in relationship to meet each other's needs, versus what we're going to be talking about today is, sure, of course our needs get met in relationship. Like we wouldn't choose somebody who we weren't getting, where we weren't having some needs met. But actually you might debate that, but what we're going to be looking at is, you know, a relationship model that is more based on growth and on, we could say, and transformation and healing and, you know, using isn't exactly the right word, but being in relationships in a way that catalyzes like new parts of ourselves and healing of old patterns.
I actually like the word using.
You do.
Yeah, I love the word using. I use my relationship to do X. Even I use my partner to do X. We have this this idea that we shouldn't use each other in relationships. And if you mean by that we should not treat each other as a means to an end, ignoring the personhood of the individual in front of us, then I say that's absolutely accurate. However, we have utility to each other, right? Or else we wouldn't be in relationship. And it's important to note, I believe it's important to note that we shamelessly use each other to advance our own ends.
So even with that, I mean, I'm gonna actually, I mean, we're already getting into the topic. So at the end, we'll do a little bit, Michael will talk about kind of his work a little bit more specifically, since we're already kind of in the topic. I am curious, yeah, like even what you just said, would you say is kind of part of a growth orientation from your perspective?
I would absolutely say that it can be part of a growth orientation. If we're talking about using the other, the question is, what do we use the other for, right, in our relationship? And a lot of people use the other in order to meet their own needs, right? Meet their own needs for sex, meet their own needs for connection, meet their own needs for being seen in a favorable light out there in the world, whatever it is that they use their partner for. However, you can also use your relationship, use your partner to heal, right? To discover more about yourself, and be in the inquiry of what it is that you want to use a relationship or use your partner for. So sure, it can be part of a growth orientation.
Yeah. Well, I was also just thinking, this is why I asked this, is that it's like being honest. The reason that it seems like you really were kind of honing in on that word is it's being honest about what we actually do, which is part of a growth orientation, right? Like, in my opinion, to say like, wow, okay, what's the truth of why I'm in relationship with this person? What is it that I actually want? And how do we communicate together and be really honest about those things? Because that actually opens up space for more intimacy. And that also opens up, it opens up space for us to be in a real relationship where we're not kind of just going through the motions, like you were naming at the beginning, of this kind of pattern of like, I'm getting these needs met and I'm completely unaware of them. And now I'm not in relationship anymore and I don't feel good. And so now I'm going to go seek another relationship, more as like an addiction pattern.
And I would say in most of our relational journeys, we often don't know why we are in relationship, right? So in my early relationships in my life, I would get into relationships based on a feeling of either sexual or romantic attraction, or just familiarity, or this like bond would grow over time. And then I just find myself in the relationship, right? And I'd be like, oh, there's something happening here. And if the person asked me why I was in the relationship, my response would be, well, I love you. Or, well, I want you, like I find you hot, or this, that, or the other thing, right? The answer that I gave would be relatively shallow, right? This is like, up until my maybe early 20s, early to mid 20s or something like that. And some people never really take it much further than that, right? There's love that develops, and based on that love, they come into a relationship without really questioning what that relationship is doing for them on a deeper level. And it's, for me, it hasn't been until after I have gotten out of a relationship like that I really understand why I was in the relationship. Does that make sense?
You're saying earlier in your life,
Yes, earlier in my life. So
oh,
let me give you an example.
yeah, great. Mhm.
So there was a time when I had gotten it was right after I got a divorce from my first wife, and I found myself after about maybe 6 8 months or so, well, no, more than that. It was more like a year and a half. I found myself attracted to a woman that I met at an event, and we had a relatively rocky relationship. It's not that there wasn't love there. It's just that we would come into conflict quite frequently. Our communication styles were different. I was going through a lot of personal trauma at the time. And whenever we would fight, my body would go into freeze or lockdown mode, right? And rather than say, well, this isn't a time for me to be in a relationship, I loved her so much I continued in the relationship and continued to work through those triggers within me. Now ultimately the relationship didn't work out, but when I go back and look at why I was in that relationship, I realized I was actually choosing that relationship so I could come into greater awareness about the things that I needed to address within myself. And those things were twofold. One, I needed to address the fact that I wasn't comfortable at that point in my life. I realized not being in relationship,
Mm.
which was a big one. And she revealed that for me. um, that relationship revealed that for me. The fact that it was just continually, trigger, blah blah blah. My life like was very destabilized during that time for a lot of it, and revealed that to me. And the second thing that that relationship did for me was changed the reason why I would get into a relationship. And the method by which I would do so. So up until that point, I was just relying on attraction, romantic attraction, sexual attraction, chemistry, and I realized through that relationship that it was an insufficient and inadequate reason to be in relationship with someone. Simply because you are in love with someone and attracted to someone is a terrible reason to enter a relationship with them, which was the big realization that I had from that relationship. I'm infinitely grateful for that relationship for that reason.
Mhm.
So that's what I mean by realizing afterwards the why I needed that relationship, why I chose it. You could even say, if you're a
Yeah.
spiritual, why my soul chose it.
Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, and it seems like that's probably pretty common when people have been in multiple relationships, that it's even if they're not growth oriented, there's usually like, oh wow, I was this way in this relationship and it didn't really work that well, or it led to this. I would guess that most people, I mean, I think a lot of, not most people will say, but I do think a lot of people probably kind of reflect on their relationship after. I'm curious because it sounds like that was a point at which you went from like relationship as like maybe more unconscious, or more as like I'm getting my needs met, but I'm not really aware of what I'm getting met, or why I'm in relationship, to like it sounds like that might have been a pivotal point in actually realizing, oh wait a second, because it's a big deal to realize, oh wait, love and attraction are not enough of a reason for me to be in a relationship. Like that's huge. I think most people don't really, like I think so many people are probably in relationship for their whole life and are like don't realize that that's the reason that they even got in the relationship in the first place.
Hmm. I would say that's absolutely accurate. The vast majority of relationships that I see out there, you know, it's kind of like the love happens, and then we kind of just like from that point make it work, right? And there's this feeling of especially within a monogamous context, that the value of the relationship is determined by its longevity, right?
Mm.
So this is one of the things that is different about a polyamorous mindset oftentimes versus a typically monogamous mindset, right? In a monogamous mindset, you enter the relationship with the idea that you are going to be together forever, because that's what a good, or at least for a very long time, because that's what the value of a relationship is. In a and not all monogamous people take this approach, but in a polyamorous context, it's much less common for that to be the orientation, simply because if you look at it in general, monogamous relationships or non-monogamous relationships tend to have a greater amount of partner turnover, right? Simply because you have more energies involved. And even though you may have somebody who has like a more or less stable partnership, if they're having other relationships outside of that, oftentimes those tend to ebb and flow and shift.
Mm-hmm.
So you begin to look at the relationships as, well, what is this relationship doing in my personal growth journey? What am I learning from this person? What is this person offering to my life?
It's it's really interesting. I want to dive into this more, but I'm thinking that right, like it's kind of with anything when you're in when it's like, let's say like heteronormative, we could say like it's like this is what we're all taught to do unconsciously almost, right? Like in this case, it's like monogamy is something that people don't question. Like I'm not saying across the board, but there's more of a sense because it's something that has been kind of what's the word that I'm looking for? It's something that we're trained in from an early age, and so there's less of a critical thinking around it and more of like like you just gave a really great example, like a successful relationship is one that you're in for 50 years. Well, where did we like create that idea? I mean, like my grandparents were together for 50 years and it was like the most codependent, dysfunctional relationship that was like, you know what I mean? Like I could go on and on
Yes.
about how that was not, and how like in the end, it's like it was so codependent that when my grandfather died, my grandmother actually had a really hard time staying alive. I mean, it was like,
Yep.
right. And so interesting that we would define it such as that. And so what I'm thinking is like, I mean, I love what you're bringing up because I think the non-monogamous relationship, right? I mean, this isn't true. Nothing's true across the board, but because it's out of the norm of what we're trained in, I think it then would allow one to actually question, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? What is this bringing up in me? I mean, I think anything that's out of the norm kind of brings up a little bit more of that growth orientation and that critical thinking.
Yes, typically. What I like to say about this is, and I just generally encourage everyone to try both, monogamy and non-monogamy, because for me, the purpose of a relationship or of relationships, both romantic and otherwise, is the expansion of consciousness, right? The more mirrors and reflections, the more situations that I find myself in, the more opportunities I have to learn about myself, the more opportunities I have to self-reflect. Now, that also doesn't mean that the more relationships I have, the more conscious I am. That is absolutely not true. However, if I've been doing things one way my entire life, then I become more fixed, more rigid, more like incapable of seeing outside of that. And I've found that my explorations into monogamy have helped my ability to be in a healthy polyamorous relationship. And my experiences with polyamory inform my capability to be in a healthy monogamous relationship.
That totally makes sense. I want to add something to this just from my perspective, which I just thought of. is that as someone who's been, I've been single a lot in my life, I actually feel like it's done the same thing because I haven't been able to, I mean, I'm growth oriented anyway, so that's just the way that I am. But for example, I really, even though I haven't been I have tried in earlier in my life, like being in more polyamorous situations, but it doesn't feel like it's my way. But one of the things that I've done is being out of relationship and being very relational and craving that kind of intimacy. I've created a lot of intimacy with people that I'm in deep friendship with, that I'm not having sexual relationships with. That actually have, some of them have been, as you could say, heated or growth oriented as people who are in relationship. I mean, in a romantic context. And so again, it made me think, like, when we step out of the norm and we're not having the experience that's like this experience that we were trained in, I think it brings up a lot of different kinds of fire, you know, in us. Brings up a lot of critical thinking of, yeah, I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it definitely does. It also brings up a lot of discomfort, doing things that we're not, that we haven't done before, right? Like a lot of monogamous people, they're like, well, I could never share, right? I could never share my partner. And when they actually put themselves in a situation where their partner is going off on a date with somebody else, it brings up that the story that we tell about who we are, right? I am somebody who X, right? This is a, you know, it's a spell. When you make a definitive statement about what you can and can't do, you create that to be the reality, right? And when you put yourself in a situation where that's challenged, you expand your capability for expression, right? So I am somebody for whom it has in the past been very difficult to share my partner, and I'm actively in the exploration of learning how to open my heart to others, right? To not view others as threats or dangers to my relationship, right? Because one of the most toxic things about some monogamous relationships is jealousy, right? If you view others as threats to your relationship, then there is an energetic constriction that's going on within you that can cause you to be skeptical, suspicious of your partner's actions. And so leaning into that edge will allow you to come into a greater sense of security in your partnership, in your monogamous relationship, or in a monogamous relationship that you could have later on. And it goes the other way around.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's also about, and this is actually one of the reasons that I wanted you to come on the show is, I mean, a while ago, I was reading some of your, I really was appreciating some of your writings about also just not putting people in boxes and what happens when, right, it's like, you know, I think you wrote a post on like the whole kind of men are this is how a man's in his masculine and this is what it looks like and this is what would be attractive to a woman, or right. And I don't remember the post, but
I read that. Yeah, I did.
Right. And so it feels like somehow that's similar to this kind of conversation, that the more that we can step out of those boxes, the more that it I mean, it opens our minds and our hearts, but the more we have to kind of confront more just different aspects of self, different parts of ourselves, you know, maybe parts of ourselves that are harder to look at, maybe parts of ourselves where we've become really rigid and it's not bringing a sense of aliveness or power, or, you know, we're not, we don't know ourselves as well. Would you add something to that? I mean, what would you add in terms of a growth orientation?
Yeah, growth orientation is essentially a path of self-discovery, right? As opposed to a path of meeting what you think that your needs are. So let's look at one of the most common situations that I encounter in my work with Open Love Style. We have a couple, and we often work with couples who have been together for a very long time, whether it's 5 years, sometimes 20 plus years, and they've reached a place in their life where their sexual connection is less than it once was naturally. That happens over time, but they're monogamous, and one of the partners has a desire to open the relationship, right? Now that can be very disruptive to a long-standing monogamous relationship. However, what I've found is that there's two things that can happen. One is that if they keep their non-growth oriented mindset, if they keep the mindset that they've been having for a long time, which is basically, keep things together, everything's stable, we raise the kids together, the family, etc. We don't explore outside the relationship because that's just not what you do. If they keep that and then enter into non-monogamy, what they're going to do oftentimes is one of the partners is going to go outside the relationship, have a steamy love affair, and just immediately go have sex with somebody else, feel like they can't talk fully to their partner about it, develop more romantic attractions and feelings for this other person, the other their long-term partner. The romance leaves the relationship, they feel threatened, they don't know how to talk about it, and eventually it leads to a schism and a split. However, when somebody does choose to get help and support surrounding entering non-monogamy, what they will often find is that their relationship, which has become stagnant and set for so long, can actually not just open up into multiple partners, but open up together. All of a sudden they're feeling like they're discovering new parts of themselves. They're creating levels of communication that they've just never had because those parts of themselves are locked up, right? And so when you can begin to communicate with your partner, hey, I'm feeling attraction for this person over here, how are you feeling about that? It opens up a level of transparency and honesty between the couple that leads to greater closeness. Mm-hmm. Now, in order for that to be held well, there also needs to be safety, which of course you can't get absolute 100% safety, but you can begin to set parameters for your relationship that allows for that safety. So for example, I'm going to go on a date tomorrow night. What do you need in relation to that? And then that person can say, well, I feel comfortable with you going on this date, and I would really request that you not sleep with them. And if you're going to sleep with someone, I really want to have a conversation about it first. That in and of itself, that process of titrating and discovering while opening up allows it either bashes the codependence out of the relationship because you can't people please, right? If I people please my partner and I say, oh yeah, go ahead, honey, do whatever you want, and they go out and they have sex with somebody and then they come back, I'm going to implode, right? Because I've just crossed my own limits and boundaries, and I'm going to make that person wrong, and I'm going to, angry and yell at them and distance. And so it is a way for a monogamous couple to begin to enter into a growth orientation. It's not the only way for that to happen, but it's one way.
Yeah, well, so it's really interesting, right? Because I mean, we titled this, it's a great example, and we titled this, it's a catalyst for personal transformation. And really what you're speaking to is it's also a catalyst for transformation of a relationship, and it's like, there's a third, I would say, of the relationship, right? Because each person transforms through that. But also you just gave a really great example of what is probably so typical, like you said, amongst many people, but especially people who've been together for a long time, have been doing it one way. And so the more that they grow internally, the more that they learn how to communicate, the more that they have to kind of challenge that. The deeper the intimacy is, the better their sex is, like the better, right? Their entire relationship gets to transform. So I love it because it's not just a personal transformation. It's actually the whole growth orientation allows for an entire transformation of the ecosystem, which is really beautiful.
Yes, both people in a relationship need to hold a growth orientation, or that relationship will not survive.
Yeah.
And each person individually is committed to their personal growth, right? So we each take that responsibility. And the function that we serve for each other in relationship is we both also serve as a stand for our partner's highest growth expression and evolution as well. And that needs to be just the benchmark, the base level from which everything else starts. And the biggest pain that I see in relationships is when a couple gets together, they're monogamous, not necessarily growth oriented, they're coming from that old paradigm, and then one person has an awakening. One person decides, well, I want to expand. I want to know more of who I am. And their partner is unwilling. That is probably the most common situation that I see. And sometimes when people come to me and they're like, my partner wants to open the relationship, I'll actually look at that and be like, well, polyamory versus monogamy is not the issue here, right? The issue is that one partner wants to explore themselves, and the other partner wants to keep on doing the thing that they've always been doing.
Yeah, and so I would say, I know you have a vested interest in polyamory. Obviously, that's what you're supportive of, and I mean, maybe that's not the right word, but I was going to say, because I think this also happens in all relationships, right? And it may be that somebody doesn't want to explore by opening up the relationship to be with other partners, but they want to, they're more on a growth path than the other person is. They want to explore other parts of themselves, or they want to explore, they might want to explore their sexuality, but not in relationship to another, to having another partner, but the person that they're with is really uncomfortable with the newness and the expansion that's happening. I mean, I'm sure you've seen that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's often the case. Especially, when I've also spent some time hanging around so-called like tantra communities or whatnot, right? When you have one partner who discovers the this way of being, which is deeply sensual. They talk about sexual energy. All these new concepts come into a person's vocabulary when they first start studying tantra, and the partner is just like, the fuck is going on here, right? So I see that with some degree of regularity.
So I have a question that's coming up. I love this topic, and I'm curious, how do I frame this? So, we talked a little bit about this when we were talking previous to the interview about, you were kind of saying like, oh, well, the jury's out on whether this is a better approach than a kind of needs-based approach. And I think my curiosity is more like, it seems like both are happening even within a growth orientation, both are always happening at the same time, because even a lot of the examples that you've been giving, and I just see this in all my relationships, like we don't enter into relationship. If something is so growth oriented that it's just like, for example, two people are just continually triggered by each other and they're not meeting any of their needs, it doesn't, like, I think we would all agree that that's potentially not the best bond. Because part of bonding, right, is like feeling that security, that safety, that attachment. But But so I think it's just it seems to me that it's an interesting dance. Like I would more say it's like not, if I'm thinking growth orientation, it's not solely about meeting needs, but even in all the examples you gave about these, which I love, like all these kind of nuanced ways of how couples, what you would encourage couples to do, how to communicate with each other, how to care for each other, all of that is also meeting each other's needs at the same time. And I've seen, I mean, the other side of that, right, is that I've been a part of a lot of, I've been privy to a lot of communities that are practicing polyamory, and yet they're not actually good at these kinds of skill sets that you're teaching your clients. And so, right, then it's like, there's a total disregard, like there's a system here. Not that there's the same system for everybody, but there are certain like principles, there are certain needs that get met that actually make this work in a way that creates more growth and information and more intimacy, right?
I think that it's important to note that what I've been speaking about is definitely growth oriented polyamory, and that's not all polyamory. And it's not, for example, take swingers, right? Or people in the lifestyle. The intent of many of those communities is simply to have, functionally romantically monogamous relationships, and then meet up with other couples and, share sexuality. The purpose of those, they're not polyamorous, they're polysexual relationships. The purpose is not growth, the purpose is pleasure, right? And similarly, if you go to some of our communities, there are things called, play parties, right? It's basically an orgy, but an orgy with parameters. The purpose of these, although they can be they can be places to learn about oneself. The purpose is also pleasure, right? We're not getting together to grow, right? Like that's not the orientation. So not everybody practices non-monogamy with an eye towards transformation or growth.
Mm-hmm. And so what would you say, like in your experience, is the interplay between, I mean, it's probably not the same for each couple, but this is the work that you're doing. So the interplay between like, okay, we're helping to meet each other's needs while at the same time we're in a growth orientation. And then I would also add to that, like, well, this is a different question, but why are you so passionate about it? Like, what have you seen in your own life, both like individually, because you've obviously been very oriented towards relationship, but also in the people that you're supporting, and like why there's so much fire around it?
Okay. Yeah. To answer the first question, I think it's important in any relationship to come to clarity about what needs you're meeting for each other. I don't know if you've ever heard of the term relationship anarchy.
Tell me.
So one of the concepts or principles that is integral to relationship anarchy is what's called like a relationship smorgasbord. So if you think about all the different ways that you can relate, you can have a structural relationship, which means that you share a household, right? And you consent to that level of relationship together. There's a sexual relationship. You can consent to either have that form of relationship or not. There's a romantic or emotional relationship. You can consent to have that or not. You have a child-bearing relationship. You can have a financial relationship. And each of these things in the relationship anarchy context gets to be continually negotiated and renegotiated. The relationship anarchist has highly fluid relationships that are consent oriented and constantly under review and revision. Now, you may not have such a high value for flow as a relationship anarchist, but it's important in any relationship that you have to have agreements about what needs you're meeting for each other, and then to fulfill those and to maintain that commitment. So agreement about what needs you're meeting, commitment to do that and to be accountable to that. And then within that creates the safety, the foundation for the relationship. And from that space, then everything else is growth and gravy, and you can explore outside of the parameters of safety that you create.
I would actually say that is hugely, I mean, even what the model you just described before you even get to the growth flow part is hugely growth oriented, because it's like the exact opposite of the way that people do. I mean, the way that we sort of mindlessly go through relationships and what you described at the beginning. So in my view, that would be growth oriented, because you're actually, and I feel like a breath of fresh air when you describe that, just because it's like to have that level of like clarity and consent. And not only is it creating safety, it's like we know what we're here doing together. And to me, that is growth. But that's how I would define that. Mhm.
Absolutely. And you know, the vast majority of people, all of that stuff is just assumed, right? It's like that's what it means to be in a relationship. Is first we have the romantic connection, and then we're either going to go towards that sexual connection, or this relationship isn't working out, right?
Yeah.
But is that true? No. I have a lover who we've never had sex, and I have an extremely deep romantic bond with this person. You know, I don't know if we'll ever have sex. And I've had, you know, people with whom I've had you know, cohabitated and had a sexual relationship with, but no romantic relationship, just, you know, out of convenience. And that worked for both of us, right? Now to answer your second question, why does this personally have so much juice for me? There's a couple of answers I have for that. And the first one is simply because I've been through so much pain surrounding the relationship. Um, I've been through some situations which I don't have time to relate necessarily right now, that have been so utterly gut-wrenchingly painful for me that I decided that I was going to devote my life to making sure that as much as I can, nobody else is going to have to go through this situation. And they were related to non-monogamy. So that's the main reason. And the secondary reason why non-monogamy has been so important to me is it really involves the circumstances of my birth. I was conceived by a mother who had basically escaped from a mental institution, and she was brought back into the mental institution. She was pregnant, and then I was born, and I was immediately adopted. Well, I was put into a foster home for a couple of months, and then I was adopted into a Roman Catholic family. So I have two lineages, one of which I know very little about. I've never met my birth mother. And the other one, I feel a middling degree of connection with. So in some ways, I've found myself not without a family, but without a family that I really feel a sense of deep belonging with. And so my explorations into non-monogamy largely have been focused on creating a feeling of family, because that's actually what I desire in life, is that feeling of closeness, feeling of belonging, feeling of family. And therefore that like love extends for me oftentimes beyond simply one partner. In particular, I found that I have the pull towards having two deep bonded relationships at a time. That exploration has allowed me to look at some of my birth trauma. And at first, when I started doing this, my two relationships were extremely rocky. I didn't know how to hold them, right? I didn't know how to have a healthy poly relationship, just like I didn't know how to have a feeling of actual familial connection. And through my exploration of multiple relationships, I've come into greater security within myself. And through that security, been able to show up in multiple relationships in a way that actually feels nourishing to me and everyone involved. But it's been a long journey.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it's a and there's so many different elements to that story. I'm curious if you were aware of your draw, let's say, towards non-monogamy as a result of this kind of, desire, or if it was like somewhere down the line, like, was there a point, like you were kind of like your other story, you were operating in a certain way, but with not as much consciousness, and then you kind of like realized it. Yeah.
It was totally unconscious, right? At first, I would get into a relationship with the intent to be monogamous, and then I would find myself just drawn to somebody else, and I'd be like, "What is this?" And then at first, when I was very much younger, I would cheat, right? And because like, oh, I can't tell my partner, but I have this drive, I have this pull, and I don't know what it is, and I didn't do that for very long, thankfully, but it really made me look at, what is this about me? What is it about me that's drawn to more than one person? Why can't I be happy? Right? Why can't I be happy just like everybody else is? And at first, I made that something wrong about myself. It's like I was bad. I was broken. There was something wrong with me. And it wasn't until I was about 24, I think, that I really came to grips with the fact that I was more than likely non-monogamous. And it wasn't until I was about 27, and I'd been in a successfully monogamous relationship for about 6-7 years. I really like buckled down and I did it, because it was important to me to be able to do that I actually gave myself permission to explore non-monogamy. So, and since that time, it's been a slow unfolding learning journey of how to do it in a way that is good for my nervous system, that allows me to have a feeling of stability in my relationships and honors the heart of everybody involved. It's a tall order.
I love your story for so many different reasons, because one, it speaks to, right, that like you could say that there's sort of a this isn't true across the board, but I'm going to say it in this context, like there's a sort of organization or an organicity, I don't even know if that's a word, but like that there was something that was driving you to, right, per our topic, there's something unconscious that was driving you to heal, right? Because through this experience of like kind of even the repetition of something that you weren't even aware of, it then opened things in you that allowed you to see, okay, this is partly why I'm drawn to this, because this is what I missed and this is what I want. And these are some like maladaptive ways that I'm maybe trying to meet these needs. And then through the experience, you've been able to see it more and more clearly, I'm sure, with every relationship, with every situation, and then bring more consciousness to it, while also getting those needs met and healing certain parts of yourself through being in relationship. And so one thing I really like about it is, I think sometimes there can be sort of a, we can be like, oh, this person's doing this because of past trauma, versus it being more holistic in my mind, or so, I don't know what the word is, but there's something about honoring, like, sure, there might be a reason, there's a draw towards something, but we don't need to pathologize it. It actually can be just part of this human and the way that they're organized. And that actually through the experience of allowing these parts, and there can be a lot of healing. And there can be, and we get to also meet the needs and heal the parts that we want to, that aren't healed, but then meet the needs that we actually do have, and allow ourselves to be exactly as we are in the fullness of our experience. So, yeah.
And that's actually why I created Open Love Style and the relationship quiz with the 5 continua, because it takes the judgment out of these things, which I often see pathologized. So the 5 continua being sexual openness versus sexual containment. Do I want to have, sexual relationships with just one or multiple people? Romantic openness versus romantic containment. Attachment versus non-attachment. And this is the one that I see pathologized more than any of the others, is attachment versus non-attachment. And I think attachment theory has a lot to do with this, because the narrative is that if you are healthy, you will have close, securely attached relationships where you can be close to others and feel comfortable in that, and generate good relationships, right? I mean, attachment theory basically posits that if you don't want or don't like attachment, then there's something wrong with you. And I don't believe that. I believe that there are many people out there, for one reason or another, who actually don't want to wake up in the morning next to someone, who actually don't desire to answer to others for what they do in their lives. And they've tried it and it doesn't work for them. And I don't think it's useful to say to that person, hey, that's your trauma. It can be an authentic, empowered choice for an individual to have relationships where they just see each other when it works for the both of them. And they have many relationships like that. And in none of them do they feel, super attached. And that's okay. It works for a lot of people.
I love that. I mean, there's something that as someone who knows attachment theory very well and is a proponent of it with a lot of the people I work with, but I love what you're suggesting, because it goes back to, in my opinion, this idea of communication and consent. Like, what you're doing, I think, in this quiz and in your work, is you're allowing people to explore every realm of possibility so that they can actually be honest with themselves, and then they can be honest with the other. And I think that's where a lot of the pain happens, even in like why attachment theory is even relevant, because it helps people to understand something through a frame. But really, it's like, if you could, when you were speaking, I was thinking, yeah, like if I really want a very securely attached relationship, and then I meet somebody and we could have an honest conversation about it, they're like, actually, I don't want these things. I don't want this. I don't want that. It's like, well, great. So we're actually not a match. And I don't need to make you wrong about that. You just get to be who you are. But now we can move forward. And that's actually what I think health is, right? It's like, it's the capacity to be able to be so, I think it's having clarity, so that we can then say, okay, this works for me, this doesn't. And actually, I'm not going to move towards the things that really don't work for me, because that's just going to make me feel like shit. And then I'm going to feel like, what's wrong with me? Like I should be doing this different. Yep. These things, all these, yeah.
I mean, for example, there's one friend that I have who runs his energy very non-attached, right? Only has, play with others in containers, doesn't make agreements with other people necessarily. And if you look at their past, had a very abusive childhood. Where you talk about, if you were to look at this person through the lens of attachment theory, I mean, their mother burned their hands, locked them in a closet and abused them, so that's some pretty heavy trauma. And it makes sense, if you look at it from that lens, that closeness with other people would feel unsafe. And for that person, it's likely true. But is it helpful to pathologize that person and say, well, that's something that you need to heal in order to have a good life? No, the person's very happy, actually. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, and that goes back to, this is actually a good place for us to kind of move towards ending, also because it's almost been an hour, but I think also because you're describing what your work is more. But I want to say that I think what that does is it in the non-pathologizing, it also allows for like I was saying before, you potentially you or this person could be like, well, I'm clear about this. And so I'm actually not causing harm to anybody else, right? Because I'm very clear about what works and what doesn't work. And so like that person actually, if they are clear about it, in my opinion, will probably cause less harm than a lot of people out there who maybe we would consider psychologically more healthy, or, oh, they don't have this trauma, but they're actually not being clear about it. And so there's a lot of like challenge happening in the field, right? For them and for the other person. So it's I love that that's what you're doing. And maybe you could talk a little bit more about Open Love Style and what it is, and for people who don't know you.
Sure.
Yeah.
So open love style is essentially for, it's a way of looking at relationships and the structure of relationships. And we've determined five, we call them the five continua of relationship configuration. I went over a couple of them that people often have disagreements about. And what it does is it asks you a series of questions that puts you graphically on these five continua, either to the left or the right. Left generally being more energetically open, right being more energetically contained. We like to use the word contained versus closed because it's less judgmental. So the areas are kink, attachment versus non-attachment, agreements versus flow, sexual openness versus sexual containment, romantic openness versus romantic containment. So if you go to openlovestyle.com, you can find out where you fall on the five continua of relationship configuration and compare it with a potential partner and see, well, where might you align, where might you not align? And you don't need to, just because you both have the same orientation doesn't mean that you are a better fit for relationship. Being able to communicate and make agreements based on your natural tendencies to form something where it's like, okay, we both agree on this is the goal of open love style. So yeah, it's a tool for helping you come to consensus.
So that's something that people could find by going to your website. And then are there other ways that people can follow you and or courses that you have going on?
Sure. Yeah, we're going to be running a program called Working Your Style, which you can sign up for the wait list on at openlovestyle.com. We're going to be running that probably a little bit later next year, probably in the late spring. We don't have a firm date yet, but you can sign up for the wait list. Additionally, Emily and I are starting some new work with couples. So where we are going to be working with one couple a year and doing a deep dive with them over the course of 3 months, preferably a couple that's been together for a while, who desires to learn about their natural configuration in openness. Actually, we're going to be going to a destination location to do a deep dive with them. If that's something that appeals to you, you can reach out to me or Emily personally and consider you for that.
Cool. Thank you. Well, I really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks for coming on the show. Yeah. And I just think I think overall, like, this is a very, very important topic in a lot of different ways. And I think really just for me, at least, it's like the mind expansion, it's the consciousness expansion. It's bringing awareness to the ways that we might be unconscious and might not, are not actually questioning kind of like the boxes that we have internalized and that we have put ourselves in. So I feel like that's a lot of what we're talking about, even though it's through the lens of relationship and polyamory.
Yep. Yeah. Relationships for me are all about self-discovery, self-knowledge, which leads to greater efficacy, greater power within yourself and in the world.
It's a beautiful place to end. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Bye.